do you think of your autobiography?
Well, it was a very difficult thing for me to write, and I wrote it at the insistence of my editor, Paula Maguire at Pantheon, and my wife. I said, you know, what should I be doing writing an autobiography? I haven't been a man of adventure. I have achieved no great deeds in life. I have not become extremely wealthy. I have not been an explorer or a great warrior or an adventurer. I've been a rather sedentary character because I was brought up really to be a Brahmin, an intellectual, and so I thought, I can't write a thing like that. But they went on insisting, and so I put myself to it, and it took me 2 years. I wasn't used to writing the narrative style. I was used to writing philosophy, and that's as easy as falling off a log. But writing narrative, I always admired novelists, you see, because of their gift of the portrayal of human character and of telling stories. And I got sucked into it. Slowly, slowly, slowly. It was very hard.
Do you consider yourself an intellectual, or
yes?
So there's nothing terrible about that term in your vocabulary.
No, not at all. I think that although some people think that my position is anti-intellectual, they don't understand that to be effective intellectually, you have to interpose thinking with intervals of mental silence, when you stop thinking altogether. Because, after all, if I don't stop talking, I can't hear what you have to say. And then thinking, in my definition, is talking to oneself, or figuring to oneself, in one's skull. And if you don't occasionally stop that activity, you don't have anything to think about except thoughts. So you get unrelated to the real universe.
A couple of your students, you might say, began a thing called Esalen, which is familiar to a lot of us.
They were students not only of me, this must be emphasized. Michael Murphy and Dick Price, who really started Esalen, were also students of Frederick Spiegelberg and Michael of Sri Aurobindo. And the confluence of us all together inspired them to start this thing.
Do you think that growth centers like Esalen, do you think that they may be truly anti-intellectual in a certain way? I mean, do you think they may be sensitivity training, maybe a training of the emotions and the openness of the emotions, and perhaps leave out intellectual?
No. The thing is absolutely fascinating what's happening. Esalen has very scrupulously avoided taking a partisan point of view to any one discipline. Although they've had very powerful people there, like the late Fritz Perls, who could have dominated the whole scene. But that never happened. Now, they are equally interested in the strictly intellectual life. For example, next March, the great British mathematician, philosopher Spencer Brown, author of Laws of Form, is coming, and he's going to give a seminar there for 10 days for a select group of some of the finest intellects in the United States. And they support that as much as they do sensitivity training and so on.
So you think they're combining?
Yes, I mean these places are the new universities. The university itself has become practically obsolete. It's a machine shop for turning out.
And there are now hundreds of these growth centers.
There are over 100 in North America.
Do you think they'll replace the university, or will there be a place for a straight university?
There will be a place for a straight university. There has to be, because people need certain kinds of technical training, which they can only get there. But I hate to say this in a democracy, but the intellectual elite will eventually emerge from the growth centers.
It's not possible they could combine the two kinds of training.
Well, the universities are interested. There's no doubt. I mean, let's not put them down too far. Life is not a black and white situation, and we have some very great universities and great scholars.
What about the other great social institution, at least it used to be, the church? Will these growth centers replace the church?
Tricky. I don't know. They are stimulating the church. Let's put it that way. See, the problem with the church and the synagogue is that they're too talkative. You go to church on Sunday and they lecture God on what he's supposed to do as if he didn't know. Then they lecture the people on what they should do as if they could or would. And it's incessant chatter. And I'm trying to persuade the church to cultivate mental silence. And I'm having some success, funnily enough, because the church is desperate. If no other reason than it's desperate financially.
Well, then, really, you mentioned what I consider the house number when you said silence.
Yes.
And the cultivation of silence. You are an admirer of Krishnamurti. He's one of the people you speak most highly of in your autobiography. And he, of course, is an advocate of mental silence completely. But he also says in many ways and in many places that one shouldn't cultivate it. It can't be cultivated.
It can't be cultivated.
So how are we to proceed from here?
First of all, if you try to cultivate it and find out that you can't stop the internal turbulence in your mind, what is called in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra the chitta vritti. He defines yoga, which means union or integration of yourself with the universe. He says yogas chitta vritti nirodha. That means yoga is the cessation of babble in the mind. Now, you can't stop it, no matter what you do. But if you realize that you can't stop it, you get the message, which is that you don't exist. That's why you can't stop it. That your ego is nothing more than a concept. It's an abstraction like the equator. And nobody will trip over the equator. So your ego is your concept of yourself. And so that concept cannot stop the babble in the mind. Now, as soon as you realize that, the babble stops of itself. As when you simply listen to pure sound. See, that's essentially the method of yoga. It's called mantra.
Krishnamurti, of course, wouldn't identify it as yoga.
Yes, but he always starts out every talk by saying it is extremely important to listen. Will you please listen? And he's trying to say, listen to the sound of my voice rather than any instructions I have to give you. Please participate in the real world. Listen, 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 and you will discover, if you truly listen, that the listening, the sound and the listener are the same process. There isn't a dichotomy of I listening on the one hand and the sound being listened to on the other. See, Krishnamurti has a terrible time explaining what he means. He's worked at it for years and years and years and published volumes of talks and so on. And I know what he's talking about. And I'm trying to say the same thing in a slightly different style. See, I think Krishnamurti is too serious. He doesn't allow laughter at his lectures. But I love him. I think he's a great man. I always allow laughter at my lectures. We get into an uproar because there's a great Zen master in this country by the name of Joshu Sasaki. And he recommends for a method of meditation that every morning you stand up, put your hands on your hips with the wrists upwards and roar with laughter for 5 minutes. And imagine if Mr. Nixon did that. Imagine if the Queen of England or Mr. Heath did that, or Mr. Kosygin, or the Emperor of Japan, or Mao Zedong. And then when you think about that, you laugh all over again.
So maybe you can't talk directly about silence. You have to do things like laugh or...
Right. Yes, you have to get into non-verbal experience. Because the real world is non-verbal.
But do you still maintain that there's some value in traditional religious forms and practices? I mean, Krishnamurti throws them all out, and but I sense with you some sort of, whether it's nostalgia or what, some sort of feeling that...
Yes, I wouldn't throw them out. I would understand them in a slightly different way, though, from the way in which they are generally understood. In other words, when I go to church, I don't expect by attending Mass that I will get some advantage from the power of God, that he will do something special for me, like get me an increase in salary. I don't even listen to the prayers. I listen to the sound of the priest's voice. That's why the Roman Catholic Church made a serious mistake in having the Mass said in the vernacular. They should have kept it in Latin. I was brought up in England, as has been indicated, and we boys were subjected to the most amazing religion of lecturing God. Almighty and most merciful God, King of kings and Lord of lords, the only ruler of princes, who dost from thy throne behold all dwellers upon earth. Most heartily we beseech thee from thy throne to behold our most gracious sovereign King George the King.
That's good.
And all the royal family, endue them plenteously with heavenly gifts, health and wealth, long to live. When all this is the language of court flattery. Because God was idolized, conceived in the image of a cosmic monarch.
Well, why is it that you went into the church at a certain point in your life for 5 years?
As an absolutely knowing subversive. But although it worked in a way, but I couldn't sustain the role of a clergyman in those days. Today it's different, but in those days I was much too much of a bohemian to wear the Roman collar and the black suit and come on like I was holier than thou. It just didn't work.
In the Zen idea of nothing special, you mentioned that Suzuki sometimes would assign his letters no special person.
Bujinin.
Seems to be the finest antidote to the holier than thou.
Oh yes.
Do you feel that way about yourself? Do you feel that you're nothing special?
Oh, I do it in a slightly different way than Suzuki.
I thought so.
Everybody knows, it's matter of public knowledge, that I'm a rascal. That I drink too much, that I sleep with too many women, that even people go so far as to say that I'm trying to commit suicide. Because Americans are terribly serious. They don't understand certain things that are understood in Europe and Asia about the joyous life. They are always wanting that everything you do is supposed to be good for you. Now, life is bad for you. As Jung pointed out, he was joking. He said life is a disease with a very bad prognosis. It lingers on for years and invariably ends with death. And, you know, everybody, mental health, everybody is after you for your best interests. And I'm sick of being pursued for my best interests.
Since there is no you anyway to have these interests.
Sure, right. But everybody's concerned. Everybody is worried about one's health, one's mortality. Because, you see, the fallacy is this. You must understand, if you're going to survive elegantly, you must not feel a compulsion to survive. Confucius put it very well. A man who understands the Tao, that is the course of nature, in the morning, can die with content in the evening. And so when anyone has a compulsion to survive, we say, well, I've got to go on living because I'm responsible. I have all these children to support. But thereby, by taking that attitude, I teach my children the same attitude. And they go on compulsively surviving for their children, and everybody lives life as a drag. So, if we would realize that we really don't have to go on living, there is actually no reason why we should continue. We're not under orders.
Well, have you already gone away, so to speak? I mean, presumably, if there's no individual ego and one sees it clearly, one has died.
Well, if you ask me, have I gone away? You see, that's a somewhat paradoxical question. Because then I would be claiming credit for being an egoistic non-ego. You know,
so it's hard. It's hard to
yes, it's hard to put it into
yourself.
our language because we've got a language constructed in such a way that it's a perpetual trap, and you can't say these things.
But presumably, you can carry on a full articulated life without thinking that it's a you or a...
Yes. Oh, of course you can. And it's much more fun than the other kind of life. And
it's like sitting in on a course, not for credit. I find
that's right. Now, that's a very good comparison. Yes.
I feel very often I'm not taking life for credit.
That's right. That's a very good comparison. Yes.
What about this California dreaming that you do? I mean, in your book, California takes on proportions, almost mythic proportions in a way. Big Sur and the people there, and the fact that you find that in that geographical location, you've found something right for you, a kind of a final place.
Yes, because it's an extremely dangerous place to live as a result of the combination of the San Andreas Fault and the Governor Reagan. But it's the most beautiful place in that it is the American version of the Riviera. I wouldn't make my living if I lived in Mentone or Ayers, because I can't make a living at my profession in any country except the United States. And therefore, California is the nearest thing to that southwestern sunlight landscape that I always sought from boyhood. And
I'm from California myself, and I feel a kind of nostalgia, but I wonder whether it's just nostalgia sometimes, or whether there's something, whether there's a kind of a holy land going on there somehow.
Oh, there is. It's one of the most stimulating spiritual and intellectual climates that there is.
I'd say equaled only by New York City.
Yes, I mean, here, naturally, there is also a tremendous gathering of fascinating people.
But there's a nature seems to be more
nature
in tune
is
with
more
it.
benign.
Yeah.
New York City has a rather tough climate, and that's why. Also, it's too industrialized.
I wanted to ask you a couple of things that people might just want to ask, because it's topmost in their minds. And in your book, you said, finally, your final feeling about LSD, roughly speaking, is that when you get the message, you hang up the phone. Is that
Yes,
where you stand?
Yes,
on that?
I mean, I would say that from my own personal point of view, if all the LSD in the world were to vanish tomorrow, I wouldn't regret it, because I think I've learned everything from that kind of experience that it has to teach.
Do you think that a whole generation of people now have done the learning for the society? Do you suppose that certain people can completely bypass the LSD experience, building on the experience of others, or do you think it's good for everyone to get lost in the woods?
That's a difficult question to answer. I don't really know the answer to that. LSD was a valuable catalyst in showing people that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy, to quote Hamlet. Dangerous, and all the more dangerous when suppressed, and when one couldn't be sure that the LSD you were getting was the real thing.
Yeah, prohibition is absolutely no good. There's no question of that.
I can't understand American prohibitionism because it corrupts the police by asking them to be armed clergymen.
But it seems to me that, as opposed to the early '60s and the '50s, that there are a lot of people in the society today who who are deeply into their consciousness through meditative techniques of one kind or another.
Yes.
And there's also a fashion tending in that direction. I mean, in other words, people are aware of it. It's not an outrageous thing.
Don't put it down by calling it a fashion.
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
In fact, could I ask you, do you think there is some sort of new age of spirit dawning, or do you think...
Whether it's a new age, that may be too pompous a phrase to use, but there most decidedly is a colossal, I would call it spiritual awakening occurring in this country. It's as alive as all get out.
Is it, do you think it's indigenous? I mean, really indigenous, or is it sustained by people coming from the East and Japan?
It's both. It's a result of global intercommunication. We're in a situation now where, by means of technological transportation and by telephonic and television and electronic communication, we've got one world. We can't help it. And therefore, all the cultures of the world are merging. And this stimulates every culture.
You mentioned, again, I'm quoting you roughly, you feel that psychotherapy is largely a bore, except for most Jungians. You would accept them. Do you think that that spiritual life in the largest sense will begin to replace psychotherapy?
The psychotherapists themselves are undergoing a great deal of evolution. We have, for example, the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, where the most extraordinary, interesting material is being published. And I know all sorts of people in the field of psychotherapy who are no longer, what shall I call it? Who are no longer preoccupied with what I've always felt to be a very shallow view of the good life. Of,
well, do you think that...
Are you in touch with reality when reality is considered as the world seen on a bleak Monday morning? Well, reality is a trip from the maternity ward to the crematorium. You know, that kind of thing, where they ask you to test your sanity. What are 9 and 7?
I don't know.
Well, heaven's sakes, but that's it. Or are you in a fit condition to drive a car? That's become a test of sanity, you see. And it's terrible.
Well, do you think that perhaps like universities, which evolve and become turned on, that psychotherapy can do the same thing, and there could be a
oh yes.
So there's a place for
yes,
for
indeed,
both of them in the society.
Indeed, there is. There are. I mean, let me not again. I want to repeat this. Not put the university as an institution down, because marvelous things are now happening in our universities. I am astonished at the response I can get from universities. In the terms of enormous audiences for lectures on the Chinese theory of nature, you know, some very far out subject of that kind.
So it sounds like the structures of society are hanging in there. They're going to persist, and perhaps they're okay and growing.
But what we've got going wrong is we've got a kind of bifurcation. You take your classified telephone directory and open up churches and have a ruler in your hand, and you will find that far the longest space is occupied by authoritarian Bible-banging churches. And these people are barbarians who take the written word of the Bible literally, because they need terribly, they have a personal need for something to depend on.
Do you think the same kind of barbarianism of the spirit is represented in our government? I mean, do you think it's the
government,
same
the
type
government,
of thing?
you see, realizes that there is a very large number of people like that, and therefore, to keep their votes, they have to pander to those kind of people. And these are the boys who never grew up. They always need Papa.
Well, what's the possibility for what's going to be the outcome of the these two different trends, this kind of in the society. Do you think that?
Well, the trouble is that the boys who always need Papa are violent. They have the guns. And they're the types of people who like to be soldiers, policemen, tough guys. And therefore, they have a great deal of power. Although, I must say, recently I had a long talk with the General of the Army, who was a Virginian gentleman who was extremely intelligent. And I was quite shocked to find out how wise he was. And I've even been invited by the Air Force to lecture at the great Air Force Academy.
You mean there's a Buddha nature in a general?
Oh, yes. I've lectured at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs and also at the Air Force Weapons Research Institute in Albuquerque. And some of those officers are brilliant men. But somehow something's wrong with their strategy. They don't know where they want to go.
I have to say this is WBAI in New York, and maybe that's a good time to ask, considering the listenership of BAI and their own political standpoint, do you think would you be accused of being a counter-revolutionary?
I'm apolitical, actually, although I'm tremendously interested in certain specific political problems. I can't buy any party or ideology. I'm not sure whether the right wing or the left wing is a greater threat to my freedom.
Can a person practice non-ego and silence and still be engaged in political life, say?
Oh, yes, definitely. In other words, you can't be effectively engaged in political life unless you do practice mental silence. Gary Snyder puts it very well. He says you can't work well for ecological causes unless you realize in the first place that it's not necessary to do anything about it. But if you realize that in the first place, that in other words the universe is automatically harmonious, if you understand that, that gives you tremendous energy to do all sorts of things.
And Gary got highest praise in your book. I mean,
Yes.
You said that you wished you could claim him as your as
my
your
disciple.
spiritual successor.
Yeah, right.
Yet nonetheless, he seems to be immersed in a more traditional Zen and more traditional practice than you. Is it true?
Not entirely. No. He is. He's done all that, but he takes it with a light heart. He doesn't come on stuffy about it.
Didn't take it for credit.
No, he didn't take it for credit.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In your book, and in general, it seems that you have a kind of non-interest in the occult and the psychic phenomena.
Yeah.
Is that a Zen background?
Yes.
That makes you that way? You
Somewhat. Think? Yes. Zen people are not interested in that.
Well, what about the idea that various Hindu practices take the consciousness into higher chakras, whereas the Zen practice keeps it in the hara, and that might account to some extent for the difference, because Indian spirituality is really very far out in comparison to Zen.
So yes and no. I mean, some of the people I know who are well into Hindu practice, Baba Ramdas, formerly Richard Alpert, Bhagavan Das, Swami Satchidananda, I find extremely companionable.
And they don't seem to be too concerned with the psychic
they
sphere.
don't spook you with miracles and all that kind of thing.
So maybe being down to earth then is a characteristic of any sort of spiritual
Yes,
person.
because you realize that what we call earth is not away from it. Tattvamasi, you're it right now. Earth is it. And I find these people, the contemporary bunch of what I'd call bhakti yogins, very enjoyable. But the only thing I'm critical of is their attitude about celibacy. They don't all have it. Because I think a person who goes for celibacy, by not exercising his sexual functions, tends to become cruel.
Mm.
And that we need to exercise those functions just as we need vitamins and exercise and breathing and all that kind of thing.
But sometimes exercising the sexual functions doesn't guarantee that one will be compassionate.
No, it doesn't guarantee anything. But I do think that if you don't do it, you tend to become uptight.
Mm. Is that a generality? Would you make certain exceptions? I mean, for instance, you mentioned a humorous episode with having tea with Swami Prabhavananda in California.
Well, I
mean, obviously he's not cruel. I mean, maybe some other effects have occurred through lifelong celibacy.
I don't want to speak of Swami Prabhavananda
no,
personally.
But cases like that.
But
Thomas Merton or something like this. I mean, there have been celibates.
There are people. I have several friends who don't really seem to have any strong sexuality.
I see.
Just like some people aren't really interested in food. These are very rare people, but I only object when they try to impose their ideas on everybody else.
And if someone is interested in food, why restrain it and torture it?
Sure.
I see that. Suppose you were to say something I consider this sort of the two foci of your position, that if it can be called a position, that there is no ego, therefore everything is attained. I mean, the beatitude is now.
Yes.
Now, can someone hear that instantly and be enlightened?
Sometimes, yes. For most people, you see, it needs some explanation. That what we call the ego is a combination of two factors. On the one hand, it's your opinion of yourself, your image of yourself, your idea of yourself, which has been brainwashed into you since you were a baby. This corresponds, on the other hand, to a certain sensation. And this sensation is one of chronic muscular strain, which we were taught when, in the beginning, Mama said, "Darling, try to go to sleep." Or the teacher said, "Pay attention. Take a careful look at this. Now listen carefully." And one does a muscular tension in order to achieve a neurological result. And this tension is useless. It's like when you're taking off on a jet plane and you think you've gone too far down the runway and the damn thing ought to be up in the air, you start pulling at your seatbelt. Now, there's a chronic strain in everybody's muscles. It may be sometimes located between the eyes, sometimes in the heart center, sometimes in the solar plexus, and sometimes in the rectum. And it's holding together. Now, I say, pull yourself together. Now, that is a completely useless muscular effort to attain a neurological result. But that is chronic, and it becomes associated with the image of yourself, and therefore corresponds to what you mean by I. Whereas, in fact, I is like EYE. It's an aperture through which the universe is examining itself. And it is always basically unconscious of itself, for the same reason that you can't bite your own teeth or kiss your own lips. The universe really, just as the edge of a sword doesn't cut the edge of a sword, the universe doesn't need to know itself, that is to say, make itself an object. Because when you make anything an object, it becomes objectionable. This is a very curious aspect of modern history, that the 19th century, 18th century mythology, which we call scientific naturalism, made a great point of taking an objective attitude to everything, and finally taking an objective attitude to the human mind, as in B.F. Skinner. See? The mind is an object, and thus there is no subject left. Well, then everything becomes objectionable, and we invent the hydrogen bomb to blow it all up. Suicide is the end of a purely objective world.
So do you feel it now, that silence? Or can you admit to it?
Oh, yes. It's a constant undercurrent.
Can one have seen this, or felt the silence, and then still have the babble go on?
Yes.
So one doesn't have to have a total silence to have.
No. If you can't meditate in a boiler factory, you can't meditate.
But what if the boiler factory is inside your skull? I mean,
even so. It's like space behind the stars. You can't have any stars without space. And so there is always in the background of whatever goes on in my head, let's supposing I'm absolutely scared stiff, that I've got cancer or the Great Siberian Itch. Nevertheless, far, far in the back of my mind, there is an incredible serenity of eternal silence. But it isn't nothing, it isn't negative in the ordinary way in which Western people think of it. We don't understand in the West that you can't have something without nothing. Nothing is tremendously important. It's the mother. It's the womb of the universe. And it's space. It's, as St. Thomas Aquinas put it, the silent pause which gives sweetness to the chant.
Did that serene space you're in touch with, did you achieve that serenity through anything that you've done in your life?
One doesn't achieve it, you see. That is sort of asking the wrong question. There's a famous story about an American visiting England who wanted to find the village of Upper Tuddenham. And he asked a yokel, "What's a way to Upper Tuddenham? Do you know where it is?" And he scratched his head and said, "Well, sir, I know where it is, but if I were you, I wouldn't start from here." And so in the same way, one doesn't quite speak of achieving it, because you have to understand first that there is no separate you to achieve it.
So it doesn't matter what one does.
What one does is mostly empty motions. But when you understand that, however, look, this is the point that people need to understand. When you understand that, you can act creatively, because you act with the whole energy of the universe behind you.
How do you respond when someone says to you, well, you say that there is this total serene space which underlines everything, but that's merely intellectual knowledge. People are saying that all the time.
But it isn't intellectual knowledge. I mean, you can't put it into words. Intellectual knowledge is what you can put into words. This is a feeling. It's one might almost say a concrete sensation.
Why is it talked of as insight then in the Prajnaparamita, if it's a feeling?
Because it's well, insight is an English word.
Prajna then.
Prajna means intuitive wisdom. the fundamental sense of life. Now, we can't talk about it because it's ineffable. That means, in Greek, what cannot be spoken, in the same way as mysticism comes from the Greek verb muin, mu, which is the finger on the lips, or as we say, mum's the word. There's something that can't be told, and that's what's important.
Mu.
Mu.
Mm.